The automatic doors stopped working at 11:47 in the morning, and for about 90 seconds, everyone inside Meridian Mall assumed it was a power issue. It wasn't a power issue. The lights were still on. The escalators were still running. The fountain in the central atrium was still cycling its programmed arc. What had stopped was specifically the exterior doors. Every single one simultaneously. And that specificity was the first thing that told me this was not a maintenance failure. Maintenance failures are random. They take one door or one circuit or one wing. What happened at 11:47 was coordinated, which meant someone had made a decision, which meant someone in an authority position knew something that the 4,000 people currently inside Meridian Mall did not. My name is Petra Vasquez. I was a loss prevention officer at Meridian Mall for 3 years. I knew this building the way a person knows a place they've spent more hours in than their own home. Its rhythms, its failure modes, its population patterns on a Tuesday versus a Saturday, where the cameras had blind spots, and where the acoustics carried sound in ways that surprised people who didn't know the layout. I was 31 years old, I was working the mid-shift, and I was standing at the junction of the East Wing and the Central Atrium when every exterior door in a 1.2 million square foot building locked at once. I got on my radio before the first customer complaint came through. I called our security dispatch, a room behind the management offices on the 3rd level, and got Marcus Webb, who had been running dispatch for 11 years and had the voice of a man who had heard every possible variant of every possible mall emergency and treated all of them with the same measured authority. Marcus said, "I see it." I said, "What is it?" He said, "External override, not from our panel." I said, "Someone locked us in from outside." He said, "City authority, the code tag is municipal emergency management." I had never heard of municipal emergency management overriding a private commercial facility's door systems. I said so. Marcus said, "Neither have I." There's a thing that happens in the first moments of a genuine crisis, before anyone fully understands what the crisis is, where the people who know a system best are simultaneously the most useful and the most alarmed, because their knowledge is precisely calibrated to the normal operation of the system, and what they're experiencing has stepped outside that calibration entirely. I felt it then, standing at the atrium junction with my radio in my hand, watching the fountain cycle and the escalators run, and 4,000 people who didn't yet know they couldn't leave. I went to the East Wing exterior doors first, the closest set to my position. They were sealed, not locked in the mechanical sense, where you could feel the engagement of a bolt, sealed in the way that a system that has been told to present an impassable surface presents one. I pushed, I put my shoulder into it. Nothing. The glass was intact. Through it I could see the parking lot, which was full of cars belonging to the 4,000 people inside, and beyond the parking lot, the access road, and on the access road there were police vehicles. 4 of them, blue and white, parked in a line across the entrance at a distance that told me. Mid-40s, she said, "I have to pick up my kids at 2. I said, "We're working on it," again with the exact same tone, because the tone was the tool and the tool had to work while I figured out what was actually happening, which was something I was still assembling from incomplete information while standing in front of a sealed door, looking at 4 police vehicles on an access road, and trying to remember what the emergency management protocol said about municipal override authority and why they would ever need to use it. My radio crackled. Marcus said, "Petra, come to dispatch, now." I went at 4 police vehicles on an access road and trying to remember what the emergency management protocol said about municipal override authority and why they would ever need to use it. My radio crackled. Marcus said, "Petra, come to dispatch, now." I went. Marcus had the external feeds up when I got to dispatch. The cameras covering the parking lot perimeter and the access road approaches. And what they showed me settled the question of why the city had locked the doors in a way that made me briefly wish the question had stayed unsettled. Marcus had the external feeds up when I got to dispatch. The cameras covering the parking lot perimeter and the access road approaches. And what they showed me settled the question of why the city had locked the doors in a way that made me briefly wish the question had stayed unsettled. The access road was not just police vehicles. Beyond the police line on the main arterial that fed the mall's commercial district, there was movement that I cataloged. The access road was not just police vehicles. Beyond the police line on the main arterial that fed the mall's commercial district, there was movement that I cataloged in the first 5 seconds as wrong in the specific way that mass movement in a public space goes wrong when the people generating it are no longer operating within the first 5 seconds, as wrong in the specific way that mass movement in a public space goes wrong when the people generating it are no longer operating with all behavior. Carrying bags, sitting at food court tables, pushing strollers, standing in lines. None of them knew what was 2 miles east and moving west with the indifference of a system that doesn't know it's supposed to stop at lines. He said, "The city locked us in because they don't have the capacity to manage an evacuation. 4,000 people on foot in an active corridor becomes part of the problem," I said. "Yes," he said. I sat down across from him at the dispatch console. There were 2 other people in the room, Yolanda Ferris, who ran the mall's retail operations and had been in a Tuesday budget meeting when the lockdown happened, and a man I didn't know named Gil Tran, who turned out to be a facilities engineer from the management company that owned the building. Yolanda was on her phone, cycling through contacts that weren't answering. Gil was looking at a structural schematic on a tablet with the focus of a person who has already moved past the question of what's happening to the question of what the building can do about it. I said to Gil, "You know this building's systems?" He said, "I designed the HVAC retrofit 3 years ago. I know every duct, every mechanical junction, every utility corridor." I said, "Emergency exits, independent of the door override." He said, 6. Fire code requires independent actuation from the primary locking system. The override can't touch them." I said, "Where?" He pulled the schematic and showed me. 6 emergency exits distributed through the building's perimeter. 2 on the north face, 2 on the south, 1 at each end of the anchor stores. All of them independent. All of them currently unobstructed. Yolanda put her phone down. She said, "I reached City Emergency Management. They told me to maintain order and wait for a status update." I said, "Maintain order with what? We have 12 loss prevention staff for 4,000 people." She said, "They said wait." I looked at Marcus. He was watching the external feeds with the expression of a man who had been watching things long enough to know that the question wasn't whether the police line would hold, but how long holding it was going to mean anything. I said, "I need the PA system." Yolanda said, "For what?" I said, "People need to know something is happening. They don't need to know everything, but they need to know enough to stay calm and stay inside. And they need to hear it from someone who sounds like they have authority. Because right now the building is 1 rumor away from 4,000 people pushing against 6 independent emergency exits simultaneously." Yolanda said, "What rumor?" As if in answer, Marcus turned up the audio on the external feed. From 2 miles east, audible even through the camera's compressed audio, the city was producing a sound that I did not have a clean civilian word for. Yolanda heard it. She handed me the PA handset. The announcement I made at 12:04 was 43 seconds long, and I've thought about every word of it many times since, because the words I chose in those 43 seconds shaped the next several hours in ways I couldn't predict. I told 4,000 people that the city had implemented a temporary lockdown of the building as a precautionary measure, that it was expected to be brief, that mall security and management were in direct contact with city authorities, and that customers and staff should remain calm and stay in their current locations while we coordinated an orderly response. I used the word precautionary twice. I kept my voice at the specific register of a person managing a known situation. Not performing calm because people can hear the performance, but genuinely occupying the part of my professional brain that had handled hundreds of smaller emergencies and knew how authority sounded when it was grounded in actual information. I did not use the word lockdown in a way that would suggest the doors weren't going to open. I did not describe what was 2 miles east. Marcus gave me a look when I set down the handset. It was not an approving look or a disapproving look. It was the look of a person who understood exactly what I'd done and was running the calculation of how long it would hold. I said, 20 minutes, maybe 30. He said, before someone with a phone figures it out. I said, before the information management problem becomes unmanageable, which gives us 20 minutes to have a plan. Gil spread the schematic on the dispatch console. I called every loss prevention officer I had to their current position and logged them on the map. 12 people in a 1.2 million square foot building with a food court, 2 anchor stores, 200 retail units, 4 parking levels, and a management infrastructure that included loading docks, utility corridors, mechanical rooms, and a maintenance network that Gil said he could navigate in the dark. I made Gil my structural consultant on the spot. He did not object. The first question was the 6 emergency exits. Independent actuation meant they could be opened from inside at any time. 4,000 people knew that, or would know it the moment someone looked up the fire code on their phone. The exits had to be manned not to prevent people from leaving. I had no authority to prevent people from leaving, but to control the rate and direction of departure if departure became the decision. Because 6 points of simultaneous egress into an active threat corridor was worse than no egress at all. The second question was time horizon. If the police line held and the city's assessment was that the lockdown was temporary, we were managing a crowd control problem with a known endpoint. If the police line didn't hold, we were managing something else entirely, and the building's architecture became either an asset or a liability depending on decisions we made in the next 20 minutes. Yolanda said, "The anchor stores, Hartfield's on the north end and Brennan's on the south. Both have loading dock access independent of the main facility." Gil said, "Hartfield's loading dock connects to a service road that runs north along the back of the commercial strip. If the police line is covering the main access road, the service road might be clear." I looked at Marcus. He pulled up the northern perimeter camera. The service road was clear. I said, "That's our first option." Yolanda said, "First option for what? We can't evacuate 4,000 people through a loading dock." I said, "Not all at once, but we can move people who have acute needs. Medical, mobility, families with young children. And we can do it in a way that doesn't trigger a general rush." I was already thinking about the order of operations. Triage the population, identify the most vulnerable, move them first through the north loading dock while the service road was clear, then reassess. It was the same logic I'd applied to shoplifting incidents and medical emergencies, and the one time a water main had burst under the food court. Start with the most urgent, work outward, keep the information gradient controlled so that the people waiting don't know enough to panic about waiting. Marcus said, "Petra." His voice had changed register. I looked at the external feeds. The police line was still there, but the movement beyond it had changed character in the minute I'd spent planning. And what the camera was showing me now was something that made the service road window feel significantly more finite than it had 30 seconds ago. I said, "How many can we move in 20 minutes? Gil said, "Through the loading dock, 50, maybe 60. I said, "Start with families." I picked up my radio. The families I could identify in 20 minutes numbered 31. Parents with young children, mostly from the food court and the play area adjacent to the East Wing, where the mall's internal geography concentrated them on Tuesday mornings. I didn't announce anything. I moved through the food court with a mall map and my security lanyard and spoke to each group individually, telling them there was an opportunity to exit through a staff area and asking if they wanted to take it. Most said yes immediately. 2 families said no. A man with a toddler said he'd rather wait for the city's update. A woman with 2 school-age kids said she wasn't going anywhere without knowing more. I respected both decisions, noted them, moved on. I was not in the business of compelling people. I was in the business of offering options while options existed. The 31 families, 47 adults and children combined, reached Hartfield's north loading dock at 12:31. Gil had walked the route ahead of us and confirmed it was clear. The loading dock's exterior door opened manually from inside, and when it opened, the service road was still empty, and the sound from the arterial was louder than it had been from the dispatch room, but still directional. East of us, not north. I put a loss prevention officer named Dara Chen at the door. Dara was 24 and had been working at Meridian for 8 months and had the specific quality of competence that shows up in people before they know they have it. She asked the right questions. She positioned herself correctly without being told. And when I said, keep them moving north along the serviced road, don't let anyone turn back, she said, what's at the end of the service road? Which was exactly the right question. I said, 2 blocks north is a residential street. From there they can navigate. She said, navigate to where? I said, away from here. She understood that was the honest answer, and that honest was what the situation required. I went back inside. Marcus's voice was in my ear before I reached the loading dock's interior entrance. Petra, the police line. It moved. Not broke, moved. There's a difference, and the difference mattered. A line that breaks is a line that has failed. A line that moves is a line that is actively choosing a new geometry, which means the people operating it are making decisions about what they can and cannot hold, and contracting to something they believe is more defensible. A contracting police line means the thing it was containing is now in the space between where the line was and where it is. I said, how far? Marcus said, they pulled back to the North Junction. That's 1 block east of the access road. I said, the access road is exposed. He said, in about 10 minutes, yes. I ran. The food court was loud with the particular noise of 4,000 people who have been waiting for information for 45 minutes and have started producing their own. I could hear the word spreading. Not the specific word, but the shape of it. The way a crowd changes acoustic frequency when the information it's processing has shifted from inconvenience to concern. Phones were out everywhere. People were showing each other screens. A group of teenagers near the Hartfield's entrance were filming the exterior through the glass with the engaged energy of people who had found a story to be inside. I went to the second person I'd specifically wanted to find since the lockdown started. His name was Thomas Osei, and he was a retired paramedic who spent his Tuesday mornings doing laps in the mall's walking program. A group of about 40 adults who used the interior circuit as a fitness track before the retail traffic got heavy. I'd spoken to Thomas dozens of times over 3 years. He was 62, sharp, calm, with the specific calm of someone who has worked mass casualty events and knows what the first 90 seconds of panic look like and how to stand against them. I found him at the walking program's usual rally point near the central atrium fountain. He had already stopped his lap. He was watching the crowd. He said, how bad? I said, getting there. I need a medical station. He said, where? I said, center atrium. Visible, accessible, projects calm. If people see someone doing triage medicine in the middle of the building, it signals that the building is managing this, not overwhelmed by it. He said, I'm one person. I said, the walking program, how many of them have medical backgrounds? He thought for 3 seconds. He said, 4 nurses, 2 EMTs, a pharmacist, and a woman who ran field medicine for the Peace Corps for 8 years. I said, get them. He was already moving. I keyed my radio. I said, Marcus, close the Hartfield loading dock. Secure it from inside. That window's done. Marcus said, confirmed. The service road option was gone. What we had now was 1.2 million square feet, 12 loss prevention officers, Thomas Osei and 8 medical volunteers, and approximately 4,000 people who were 45 minutes into understanding that this was not a brief precautionary measure. I needed to tell them something true. The second PA announcement was harder than the first because the first had been a management of uncertainty and the second had to be a management of known bad information. And those are entirely different skills. I made it at 12:48. I told them the city was dealing with a significant public safety situation in the Eastern Commercial District. I told them Meridian Mall was secure and that security and management teams were coordinating with city authorities. I told them we had medical support available in the central atrium. I told them the building had sufficient resources for everyone to remain safely inside while the situation developed. I told them we would update every 30 minutes. I did not tell them the police line had contracted to 1 block east of the access road. I did not tell them that the loading dock option was closed. I did not tell them what significant public safety situation meant with any specificity. After I set the handset down, Gil looked at me and said, "You're managing the room." I said, "That's my job." He said, "At what point does managing the room become misleading the room?" It was a fair question, and I'd been asking it to myself since the first announcement. I said, when the information I'm withholding would change someone's decision in a way that benefits them more than the stability it costs to share it. He said, "And right now?" I said, "Right now, everyone in this building making a simultaneous decision to rush the emergency exits produces a body count. The information I'm withholding is preventing that. When I have a better option than panic, I'll provide the information." Gil said, "What if the better option doesn't come?" I said, "Then I'll tell them the truth and we'll manage the panic as well as we can." He nodded. Not agreement, exactly. Acknowledgement that the logic was coherent and that coherent was the best available standard. Thomas established the medical station at the atrium fountain within 20 minutes of my conversation with him. 8 people arranged with visible purpose. A supply of first aid materials from the anchor store's pharmacies that Yolanda had authorized pulling, a clear signage system that Dara Chen had found in the management office's emergency supply cabinet. It looked like competence. In a crowd that was searching for evidence of competence, it functioned as a stabilizing signal. The walking program regulars who weren't in the medical group became something I hadn't asked them to become and didn't have to. Distributed calm. They spread through the food court and the atrium and the main corridor, not with any formal instruction from me, but because 40 adults who know a building well and have been doing laps in it every Tuesday morning for years are, it turns out, exactly the kind of ambient presence that prevents localized panic from becoming contagious. Thomas found me at 1:15. He said, "I have a diabetic in crisis. We're managing it, but I need more insulin than we pulled from the pharmacy. Hartfield's has a full pharmacy section." I said, "Yolanda has the authority to open it." He said, "She's already talking to the pharmacist, but Petra." While I was in Hartfield's, I went to the north face windows. He paused. I said, "Tell me." He said, "The access road." I could see the access road from the third floor display windows. He said it with the specific measured delivery of a paramedic describing a scene he's assessed and is reporting without editorializing, because editorializing costs response time. I said, "How close?" He said, "They've crossed the access road. They're in the parking lot." I processed that in the same second I received it. The parking lot was the mall's immediate exterior. Between the parking lot and the building's exterior wall was approximately 30 feet of sidewalk and landscaping. Between the exterior wall and the interior was glass. Commercial storefront glass, rated for impact but not for sustained mass pressure. I said, "How many?" Thomas said, "From what I could see, more than the parking lot can hold." I said, "Go back to the medical station." He went. I stood for 3 seconds in the food court corridor and made a complete inventory of everything I knew and everything I had and what the relationship between the two sets was. Then I went to find Gil Tran and talk about the mechanical room on the 4th level. Gil's knowledge of the building was different from mine in a way that I didn't fully appreciate until we were standing in the 4th level mechanical room at 1:30, and he was showing me things I'd walked past for 3 years without understanding. My knowledge was operational. Population flow, camera coverage, response protocols, the human geography of 4,000 people moving through commercial space. I knew where people went and why and what they did when the system broke down. Gil's knowledge was structural. Load-bearing relationships, utility infrastructure, the way a building sustains its own weight and manages the stresses placed against it. The 4th level mechanical room was relevant for 3 reasons. The first was elevation. 4 stories above the parking lot gave us a sight line that the cameras couldn't provide. The cameras were external, and 3 of the 4 covering the parking lot's north face had been damaged in ways Marcus couldn't explain until we saw the parking lot from the windows. The damage was not equipment failure. I won't describe the parking lot in clinical detail. I'll say that what I saw from the 4th level mechanical room windows confirmed Thomas's assessment and exceeded it, and that I stood at the glass for approximately 45 seconds before I made myself stop looking and think about the next decision instead of the thing generating the need for it. The second reason was the roof access. Gil said, "The mechanical room has a roof hatch. The roof is flat, commercial grade, rated for maintenance traffic. It runs the full length of the building. I said, access from the roof to what? He said, the parking structure. Levels 3 and 4 of the parking structure connect to the mall building at the third floor skywalk. The skywalk crosses from the parking structure's top level to the mall's third floor. It's glassed in, climate controlled, completely interior. I said, the parking structure is elevated. If we can get people to the upper levels of the parking structure? He said, the ramp access from the parking structure's upper levels exits on the north side, the residential street, 2 blocks from where you sent the families. The residential street was still north of the access road, still potentially clear. The third reason was the radio. The mechanical room had a maintenance communication panel, an old hardwired system that connected to external utility relay stations, predating the building's wireless infrastructure. It wasn't internet connected, wasn't cellular. It was a copper wire link to the city's utility management network, which in 2024 was used for approximately nothing except notifying the mall when a grid segment was going down for maintenance. Gil said, it's still active. The utility network doesn't go down when cellular does. I said, who's on the other end? He said, city utility management, which in an emergency routes to emergency coordination. I said, can you make it transmit? He said, I can make it transmit. He went to the panel. He worked with it for 6 minutes, which was 6 minutes during which I stood at the window and forced myself to watch the parking lot and count what I could count and build the most accurate possible picture of the timeline I was working with. What I counted gave us, at the current rate of progression, approximately 90 minutes before the exterior glass on the ground floor faced pressure that the glass was not designed to manage. 90 minutes was not enough time to evacuate 4,000 people through a parking structure skywalk. It was enough time to move a significant portion of them to a position above the ground level. Gil got the panel transmitting at 1:41. A voice came back. A woman, professional, the specific cadence of an emergency coordination operator. She said, Meridian Mall, this is City EOC. Confirm your status. I took the handset from Gil. I said, this is Petra Vasquez, Loss Prevention Supervisor, Meridian Mall. We have approximately 4,000 people inside. Ground floor exterior glass is our primary vulnerability. I need to know if the north residential service route is clear, and I need to know how long it stays clear. She said, stand by. I stood by. Outside the window, the parking lot told its story without narration. The EOC came back in 4 minutes with information that changed the geometry of every plan I'd been building. The north residential route was clear, but not indefinitely. They estimated a 2-hour window before the movement pattern they were tracking from aerial observation reached the residential grid. 2 hours from now, meaning approximately 90 minutes from the moment I was standing at the 4th level mechanical room window. They also told me something I hadn't asked. There was a National Guard staging position at the high school 6 blocks north. They'd been building it since 0800. It had vehicle capacity, and it was receiving people. The route from the mall's parking structure north exit to the high school was 2 blocks on foot. I said, can they come to us? She said, they're staging for a corridor operation. They can't detach. I said, so we come to them. She said, if you can move 4,000 people through a residential corridor in 90 minutes, yes. I sat with that number, 4,000 people, 90 minutes. A route I couldn't fully assess through residential blocks I'd never walked in a crisis. To a position I was being told existed but hadn't seen. I said, I can't confirm 4,000. I can confirm a significant number in the first movement and a holding position for the remainder. She said, what's your holding position? I said, parking structure upper levels, above the ground floor threat, interior access, structurally sound, defensible for a secondary extraction. She said, we can work with that. Move your most mobile population first. Hold the remainder elevated. We'll have a vehicle column at the parking structure north exit in 90 minutes. She said it with the confidence of a person who had been running this kind of coordination for hours and had developed an operational rhythm for it. I said, confirmed. I looked at Gil. He said, You're splitting the population. I said, I'm triaging it. Mobile first through the residential route, everyone else elevated in the parking structure. It's not ideal. He said, it's the right call. You can't move 4,000 people at the same speed. I went to the radio. What followed in the next 20 minutes was the hardest communication problem I've ever managed, and I've thought about the specific choices I made many times since, not always with confidence that I made them correctly. I made the third PA announcement at 1:52. I told them the truth. I told them there was an active threat in the parking lot, that the building's ground floor exterior was a vulnerability, and that we were executing a movement plan to relocate everyone to a safer position inside the building, and then to a National Guard staging area 6 blocks north. I said the plan had two components. People who could move quickly on foot would go first through a route I would describe, and people who needed more time or had mobility limitations would move to the parking structure where a vehicle extraction would meet them. I said this is not a panic situation. It is a movement situation. There is a difference, and I need you to hold that difference in your mind for the next 90 minutes. Marcus told me later that the food court went completely silent for 4 seconds after I said that. Then it began to organize itself. That's the thing I did not expect and have not been able to fully account for since. 4,000 people told the truth about a genuinely dangerous situation with a specific plan, and a person on the PA who sounded like she had authority organized themselves, not perfectly, not without friction, but with a collective competence that exceeded what I'd been crediting them with. Because I'd been crediting them with the behavior of a crowd, and they turned out to be, when given real information, capable of the behavior of a community. Thomas deployed his medical team through the food court. Dara took the east wing. Marcus coordinated from dispatch and kept the cameras running and told me what he saw in real time. The walking program regulars, 40 people who knew the building, became the movement guides without being asked. They'd heard the announcement, they understood the route, and they positioned themselves at the junction points and directed traffic with the calm efficiency of people who had been doing laps in this building long enough to own it. I went to the third-floor Skywalk junction and opened the parking structure connection. At 2:07, the first section of ground floor exterior glass on the south face failed. I heard it from the third floor. A sound that I will describe only as the sound of a building being asked to do something it was not designed to do. And I said into my radio, evenly, ground floor south is compromised. All personnel, ground floor south is compromised. Everyone moves now. Everyone moved. The movement had a shape to it, and the shape mattered as much as the speed. People who could move fast, younger, unencumbered, without children or mobility needs. I directed north through the Hartfield's interior stairwells to the third-floor Skywalk and into the parking structure. From the parking structure, they could exit the north ramp on foot and head for the high school. I estimated that population at somewhere between 1,800 and 2,200 people. Roughly half the building. The remainder, families with young children, elderly, mobility impaired, and anyone who needed Thomas's medical team for reasons we discovered as the movement began. Went to the parking structure's upper levels, 3 and 4, above grade, interior access only from the mall side, with the Skywalk as the connection point and the north ramp exit as the vehicle extraction point. The movement from the building to the parking structure was my primary job for the next 40 minutes. I stood at the Skywalk junction and I watched it flow, and I managed the friction points. The places where people slowed, where decisions had to be made about which direction someone was capable of going, where a family needed guidance about whether to split up and move faster or stay together and move slower. I made those calls individually, person by person, as fast as I could make them. The person I remember most clearly from that 40 minutes was an older man named Earl, who I knew from the walking program. He was 78 and he had a walker, and he was trying to manage the Skywalk connection at a pace that the flow behind him couldn't accommodate. I said, Earl, parking structure, level 3, we have a vehicle coming. He said, I know how to walk. I said, I know you do, level 3. He said, where are you going to be? I said, I'll be here until everyone is through, then level 3. He said, "Promise?" I said, "Yes." He went, "I have thought about that yes many times." Marcus was monitoring both the interior movement and the exterior cameras, and at 2:31 he told me the south face ground floor was fully compromised and that the ground level of the mall building was no longer something I should consider accessible. I logged it and kept directing movement. At 2:38, Yolanda came to the Skywalk junction. She said, "Ground floor Brennan's is breached." I said, "How far in?" She said, "They're in the cosmetics section." I said, "That's 2 anchor stores from the Skywalk. We have time." She said, "Do we?" I looked at the flow of people still coming through the Skywalk. I looked at my watch. I said, "Marcus, population count. How many are still on mall floors below 3? Marcus ran the camera count. He said, "Approximately 600, mostly in the food court and East Wing." I keyed the general radio. I said, "All loss prevention, sweep below level 3. Anyone still on mall floors, move them to level 3 parking structure. We are closing the lower levels. You have 15 minutes. I said to Yolanda, "Take the East Wing sweep." She said, "I'm a retail operations manager." I said, "And right now the East Wing better than anyone on my team. Take it." She looked at me for exactly 1 second. Then she went. The 15-minute sweep found 231 people still on the lower mall floors. Some were confused. Some were deliberately hiding. A group of 6 in a storage room behind a vitamin shop who had decided that staying put was safer than moving and needed 2 minutes of direct conversation to be convinced otherwise. A family who had barricaded themselves in a restaurant kitchen and couldn't hear the PA over the ventilation. Each one required a different approach, and none of them required force. I want to be explicit about that because it matters to how I understand what happened. At no point during the sweep did any of my team or I compel anyone physically. We found people, we told them what was happening, we told them what the option was, and we gave them the choice. Everyone chose to move. Not because they were forced, but because when the information was real, and the option was real, and the person giving it was standing in front of them making eye contact, they chose. I've thought about that too. We closed the Skywalk at 2:54 and sealed it from the parking structure side, using a manual gate that Gil had identified during our mechanical room conversation. Below us, the mall building was reporting its own condition through sound, a distributed structural narrative that I translated as I climbed from the Skywalk to the parking structure's 3rd level. Level 3 held approximately 2,400 people. They were distributed across the open-air deck in groupings that had organized themselves by affinity. Families together, the walking program cluster near the north ramp, Thomas's medical station re-established in the center of the deck with the same visible calm it had projected at the atrium fountain. Earl was in the northeast corner with a small group of walking program regulars, standing at the low wall, looking north toward the residential street. He said when I reached him, "You kept your promise." I said, "I try to." The EOC came on my radio at 3:04. The woman's voice said, "Meridian Mall, we have a National Guard column at your north ramp. 3 vehicles. We can take approximately 200 per run. Confirm your parking structure population." I said, "Approximately 2,400, plus approximately 1,800 to 2,200 who went north on foot." She said, "Foot traffic has been reaching the staging area. They're being processed." I said, "Confirmed. We're ready at the north ramp." The vehicles came up the ramp at 3:09. 3 armored transport vehicles with National Guard personnel, moving with the specific organized purpose of people who have been doing this all day and know exactly how it works. A sergeant named Torres stepped out of the lead vehicle and walked to me. He said, "You the supervisor?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You moved 2,200 people on foot to our position in 90 minutes. I said, "My people and 4,000 civilians who decided to help." He looked at the 2,400 people on the deck. He said, "This is going to take multiple runs. Elderly and medical first?" I said, "Thomas Osei at the center station is running medical. He knows the priority order." Torres went to Thomas. I stood at the north ramp and watched the first vehicle load, and I thought about the 43-second announcement at 12:04 and everything that had happened between that moment and this one. And I thought about the choices I'd made about what to say and when to say it, and whether those choices had been correct. The parking lot below was no longer something I could account for. The level 3 deck was full of people who were alive. I went to help Thomas with the loading. The extractions ran until 6:20 p.m. Torres's vehicles made 9 runs between the parking structure north ramp and the high school staging area. Each run took approximately 22 minutes. 9 minutes to load, 9 minutes of travel, 4 minutes to offload and return. I tracked the runs on a count sheet that Gil produced from the mechanical room's supply cabinet. It was an inventory sheet designed for tracking parts. We adapted it. The loading sequence was Thomas's, and it was meticulous without being slow. Medical cases first, mobility limited next, elderly with families with young children, then general population in the order they'd queued at the ramp. Nobody argued the sequence. I've wondered about that since, whether the visible logic of it made it self-enforcing, or whether 4,000 people who had just spent 3 hours being told the truth by someone who kept her word had developed enough trust in the process to let the process work. I think it was both. Dara Chen ran the queue management for the first 4 extractions, then handed it to Desmond from the walking program, a retired logistics manager who had been doing laps every Tuesday morning because, he told me during the 3rd extraction, he'd spent 40 years moving things efficiently, and walking was the one efficient thing he'd found that didn't require a spreadsheet. I spent those hours doing what I'd been doing since 11:47, moving through the population looking for friction points, finding them, addressing them before they compounded. There were 17 medical incidents during the extraction period. Thomas and his team managed all 17. The diabetic crisis from the Hartfield's pharmacy run stabilized. A woman in the 6th extraction run went into labor. Early, probably stress-induced, 36 weeks. And Thomas made the call to hold her for the final run to ensure she'd had the fastest route to the staging area's medical tent. Her name was Carol. She was 33. She kept apologizing for complicating the process. Thomas kept telling her she wasn't complicating anything. Gil stayed in the parking structure throughout, monitoring the structural connection to the mall building and giving me status reports at 20-minute intervals. At 4:15, he told me the 3rd floor skywalk was no longer structurally sound for crossing. At 5:03, he told me the mall building's 2nd floor interior was compromised. He reported these things with the flat precision of a man reading instruments, which was exactly what he was doing, and I received them the same way, as data that updated the timeline and the priorities without changing the fundamental task. Marcus was the last to leave the dispatch room. He'd stayed at the cameras until the external feeds stopped being useful, which happened at 4:47, when the parking lot conditions rendered the camera data irrelevant to the decisions we were making. He came up through the mall stairwell, which was still accessible from the parking structure side, and arrived on level 3 at 5:20 with his dispatch log under his arm. He handed it to me. He said, "Complete camera log from 11:47 to 16:47, 5 hours. I said, "Why are you giving it to me?" He said, "Because you're going to have to explain what happened here, and you should have the record." I said, "You should keep it. You made it." He said, "I'll tell them what I saw. You explain the decisions." He put the log in my hand. I didn't argue. The 9th and final extraction run loaded at 6:09. 83 people, including Carol, Thomas, and his medical team, Yolanda, Gil, Marcus, Earl, Dara, and Desmond. Torres's lead vehicle had a seat for me in the cab, which Torres had noted at the beginning of the final run, with a look that told me he was accounting for the question of who gets on the last vehicle. I finished my count. I walked the level 3 deck completely. Every corner, every group, every person I'd been tracking since 2:07. I checked the north ramp to confirm it was clear. I checked the stairwell access to the skywalk and found it exactly where Gil had said it would be. Closed, sealed, no longer a viable connection to what was below. I got in the cab. Torres pulled down the north ramp at 6:20. I watched the parking structure recede in the side mirror, and I held the dispatch log on my lap And I thought about the automatic doors that stopped working at 11:47, and the 43 seconds I spent on the PA at 12:04, and all the distance between those 2 points. The residential street was empty. We drove north. The high school staging area was organized in the way that provisional systems organized by competent people under pressure are organized. Not elegantly, but functionally, with a clear internal logic that served its purpose even where the aesthetics were rough. The gymnasium was intake, the cafeteria was medical, the parking lot was vehicle staging, the football field had been cleared and marked with colored flags indicating assembly zones, and the assembly zones were organized by arrival origin. Where you'd come from, who had brought you, what route you'd traveled. It was a documentation system as much as a population management system. Everyone who arrived was being asked to account for themselves, and the accounting was building a real-time picture of who had made it out of what parts of the city and what that implied about the areas those people had left. Torres handed our group off to a National Guard lieutenant named Park at the gymnasium entrance, and Lieutenant Park looked at our count. 2,394 extracted from the parking structure over 9 runs, plus an estimated 2,100 who had walked the residential route earlier. And she looked at Torres and said, "From Meridian," Torres said, "All of them." She looked at me. I said, "Petra Vasquez, Loss Prevention Supervisor." She said, "You manage the movement." I said, "My team and the building's population." She said, "I need a debrief, the movement methodology you used. We've had 3 other large commercial sites in the city today, and none of them produced numbers like this." I understood what she was telling me, and it was not the kind of information that arrived as good news regardless of its content. Other large commercial sites. I thought about what that meant and what it implied about the sites that hadn't produced numbers like this. And I filed the thought in the place where I was keeping all the thoughts that I didn't have room for right now and would have to process later. I said, "I'll give you everything, but I have people who need to be processed first." She said, "Agreed. 30 minutes. I went into the gymnasium. The people from Meridian were distributed through the intake area in the groupings that had formed on the parking structure deck, which were the groupings that had formed during the movement, which were the groupings that had formed organically in the first hours of the lockdown. They had an internal cohesion that I could see from across the gymnasium. A quality of mutual recognition that is not friendship but is something adjacent to it. The recognition of people who have been through a shared sequence of decisions and have come out the other side still proximate to each other. Thomas found me immediately. He said, "Carol's in the medical section, 36 weeks, stable. They have an OB on staff." I said, "Good." He said, "Earl is asking for you." I found Earl in the northwest corner of the gymnasium, seated on a cot with the walker beside him, drinking something hot from a paper cup. He said, "You kept your promise." I said, "I told you I would." He said, "People say that. You meant it." I sat down next to him for a moment. Not because I had time. I had 30 minutes before Lieutenant Park's debrief and 100 things that needed to happen in those 30 minutes. But because Earl was 78 and had walked the mall every Tuesday morning for 6 years and had called me by name every time I passed his walking group, and sitting next to him for 60 seconds was something I could give him that didn't cost anything except 60 seconds. He said, "What happens to the building?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "I've been walking it for 6 years. I know where every bench is." I said, "I know." He said, "It was a good building." I said, "Yes." Then I stood up and went to find Yolanda because Yolanda had the staff records and Lieutenant Park was going to need them. The debrief with Lieutenant Park lasted 90 minutes, not 30, and by the end of it, she had called in 2 additional people from the EOC coordination team who had been running parallel operations at other locations in the city. The methodology question was the one they kept returning to, not the tactics. Moving people through the parking structure, using the skywalk, coordinating with Torres's vehicle column. Those were operational decisions that made sense in context and didn't require extended analysis. What they were trying to understand was the communication approach, the sequential announcements, the decision about what to say and when to say it, The way the population had organized itself once given real information and a specific plan. I walked them through every announcement. I told them exactly what I'd said and what I'd withheld and why, at each point, I'd made the choice I made. One of the EOC coordinators, a woman named Diane who had been running logistics for the city's emergency management division for 15 years, said, "Most operators in your position either over-communicate or under-communicate. Over-communication produces panic. Under-communication produces a trust deficit that compounds when the situation deteriorates. You threaded something in between." I said, "I've been managing crowds in that building for 3 years. I know what people do when they don't have information, and I know what they do when they have too much at once. What I tried to do was give them what they needed to make good decisions, in the sequence they needed it, at the pace the situation allowed." She said, "Where did you learn that?" I said, "Loss prevention. Every shoplifting case is a communication problem before it's a law enforcement problem." She said, "You should write it down." I looked at Marcus's dispatch log, which I'd been carrying since level 3. I said, "Start with this." The debrief broke at 9:15 p.m. The high school staging area was quieter than it had been at 6:20. The gymnasium processing was mostly complete. The medical section was handling its cases. The football field assembly zones had filled and partially emptied as people were moved to secondary facilities with more permanent capacity. Marcus came to find me after the debrief. He said, "Final count from intake, 4,311. I looked at him. He said, "Some came in from the residential route that we didn't send. People who joined the column from houses along the corridor. The guard counted them with ours." I said, "We had 4,000 in the building?" He said, "People follow organized movement. When they saw a column, they joined it." I thought about that. Marcus said, "You started something that got bigger than you started it." I said, "That's either a good thing or a very bad thing." He said, "Today it was the first one." He handed me his own cup of something hot from the field kitchen. I drank it. Outside, the city was dark in the way that cities are dark when the power grid has contracted to its emergency configuration. Not completely dark, but selectively lit, with the specific geography of a system that is maintaining its most critical functions and releasing everything else. The high school lights were on. The football field lights were on. In the medical section, I could see movement through the cafeteria windows. Thomas's team still working because the work didn't stop at the building's boundary, it just changed venue. I thought about Meridian Mall, the fountain that was still cycling when the door stopped working, the escalators, the food court noise, 4,000 people on a Tuesday morning who had not known yet what was 2 miles east. I thought about everything the building had held, and everything it had asked of the people inside it, and the specific debt I felt toward both. Lieutenant Park offered me a role in the coordination team at 10:30 that night, and I want to describe how that offer arrived because it tells something true about the difference between the job I'd had and the job the situation was creating. She didn't frame it as a promotion or a reassignment. She said, "We have 11 other large commercial sites in the city that are still occupied and uncoordinated. We have operators in those sites who are doing their best with information they don't have and methodologies they're building in real time. You spent today building a methodology that worked. I need someone to transmit what you learned to the people who are doing it wrong right now." I said, "I'm a loss prevention officer." She said, "You're someone who knows how crowds behave under genuine pressure and how communication can shape that behavior. And that knowledge is more useful to me tonight than anything I can deploy for my current team." I said, "What does the role involve?" She said, "Radio contact with site operators. Walk them through what you did, not the specific tactics. Those will differ by site, the communication principles, the information sequencing, what to say and when." I said, "You're asking me to teach from one day's experience." She said, "I'm asking you to teach from one day's experience that produced 4,311 survivors. If you have a better qualification threshold for this specific situation, tell me." I didn't. I said yes. The radio station they set me up at was a folding table in the high school's library, which had been converted into a secondary EOC communications hub. 3 radio operators working adjacent frequencies, monitoring the city's occupied sites and relaying information to the main coordination center across town. A whiteboard on the wall where the librarian had posted the Dewey Decimal categories 4 months ago, now covered in a grid of site names, population estimates, and status codes. I looked at the whiteboard for a moment. Then I sat down. The first operator I reached was a woman named Heloise, running a grocery distribution warehouse in the Southwest Corridor. 300 people, 2 days in, no prior emergency management experience, holding position and waiting for instructions that hadn't come. She was making the communication errors that Park had described, over-withholding it in the early hours, then oversharing when the pressure spiked, and the combination had produced a population that didn't trust the information it was receiving because the information had been inconsistent. I talked to her for 40 minutes. I didn't tell her what to do. I told her what I'd done and why and what I'd been thinking at each decision point. And I let her find the translation for her own situation. The warehouse was not the mall. Her population was not my population. But the underlying problem, how do you give people enough truth to make good decisions without giving them so much that the truth itself becomes a threat, was the same problem, and I'd spent a day developing a working theory of it. Heloise ran her first honest announcement at 11:15 p.m. She called me back 20 minutes later. She said, "They organized." I said, "They will." She said, "Just like that?" I said, "They want to. People want to help the situation they're in. They just need to know what the situation actually is." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Why does that sound obvious and not obvious at the same time?" I said, "Because we spend a lot of time in normal situations managing information to control outcomes. And we assume that's what we should do in emergencies. But emergencies aren't normal situations, and the people in them aren't the crowd you manage. They're the community you're part of." She said, "Did you know that before today?" I said, "Not the way I know it now." Marcus appeared at my table at midnight with food from the cafeteria and the dispatch log open to a blank page. He set both down. He said, "You should eat, and you should write down what you just said to her." I said, "The Heloise conversation?" He said, "Everything, from 11:47. I looked at the blank page. I said, "You start. You have the camera timestamps." He sat down. He opened his pen. He started at 11:47 and wrote the time, and then he looked at me. I started talking. The document we produced over the next 3 hours was not a formal report. It was not organized the way an official debrief document is organized. It was a chronological account written in 2 voices. Marcus's timestamps and camera observations, my decision rationale. And it covered every major choice from the lockdown to the final extraction, including the choices I wasn't certain about and the moments where I had acted on incomplete information and accepted the uncertainty rather than waiting for certainty that wasn't coming. Lieutenant Park reviewed it at 3 a.m. and then did something I didn't expect. She had it copied and distributed to every site operator currently active on the coordination network. Not as a policy document, not as a training manual, just as an account. She said, "People learn from stories better than from protocols." I thought about that. I thought about the 43-second announcement at 12:04 and the choice I'd made to say the word precautionary and the choice I'd made not to describe what was 2 miles east. In the moment at 1:52 when I decided the withholding had done what it could do and the truth was now the better tool. I thought about the 600 people that Marcus's sweep count had found still on the lower floors 15 minutes before the south face ground level failed. I thought about the 31 families through Hartfield's loading dock, the pharmacist who was now in the medical section, Desmond with his spreadsheets, Dara at the loading dock door asking the right questions, the walking program regulars who had become infrastructure without being asked. I thought about Thomas at the fountain, and Earl at the north wall, and Carol in the medical section, and 4,311 people who had come through a count that Marcus started at 11:47 and finished at intake. Gil found me at 4 a.m. sitting at the library table after Marcus had gone to find a cot. He said, I've been talking to the engineering team here. They want to assess other commercial structures in the city for conversion to holding positions. The parking structure model: elevated, vehicle accessible, interior connection. They think it can be replicated. I said, you should lead that. He said, they said the same thing. He sat down across from me. He said, you know what I keep thinking about? I said, what? He said, Foster. I said, the shelter man? He said, no, the building, Meridian. It was designed to move people through it in one direction, into the stores, to the products, back out. Everything in the architecture was optimized for that flow, and today we used it for the complete opposite purpose, moving people away from threat, upward, out through a direction the building wasn't designed for. And it worked. I said, what does that tell you? He said, that the building was more capable than its purpose. That what a structure is designed for and what it can do are different things. And that sometimes you need a situation that has nothing to do with the original design to find out what it was actually capable of. I sat with that. He said, I think that's true of the people too. The library was quiet around us. Through the window, the football field lights were still on, and the assembly zone flags were still in their positions. And the city beyond the high school perimeter was doing whatever the city was doing in those hours, which was something I could account for only in fragments. At 5 a.m., Lieutenant Park came into the library and said the morning coordination briefing was starting in the cafeteria, and she needed both of us there. I stood up. I picked up the document. Our document, Marcus's and mine, and I carried it into the cafeteria with the same hands I'd used to manage a crowd all day, and I sat down at a table with 12 people who were trying to understand a city in crisis from the accumulated evidence of what people had survived within it. I put the document on the table. I said, start from the beginning. And I told them what had happened from 1147 and what it meant and what it did mean and what we still didn't know. The way you tell it when you're part of what you're telling. People ask me what I took from Meridian when tourists drove us north. Nothing. I had my radio, Marcus's log, and the clothes I'd been wearing since 0800. 3 years in that building, and I left with the same nothing I brought in every morning. The professional inventory of a person whose value to the space was not stored in the space. What I took was different from what I carried. I took the knowledge that 4,000 people, told the truth, will organize themselves. That the instinct for collective function under genuine pressure is not something you install in a crowd. It's already there, waiting for the information that allows it to activate. My job at 152 wasn't courage. It was the decision to trust that. Earl still walks, different building now. A covered market 4 miles from where Meridian stood. He covers the same distance, same pace, same Tuesday mornings. He found me 6 months after the staging area. He said he'd been looking. You said you'd be there until everyone was through. I said, I was. He said, I know, I counted. I think about that count. Marcus's count, Earl's count, the intake team's count, 4,311. A number is not a conclusion. It's an accounting. This is mine.